A sign of integrity is admitting when you got something wrong or stating that you were a bit overzealous in your previous statements. There are times when I hastily formulate some of my arguments, and I've even done that in a couple of my responses to Dr. Kipp Davis. That's going to be the first thing that we cover in this video today, and then I want to show you how Dr. Kipp Davis has softly walked his statements back on whether or not James, the brother of the Lord, is an actual apostle. So if you want to fuck around and find out how Dr. Kipp Davis moonwalks back his statements on James, the brother of the Lord, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Like I was discussing at the very beginning of this video, integrity is very important to me, and it has been pointed out, primarily by the host of the video that we are about to review, that I hastily made an argument that doesn't accurately represent the process that the NIV translation of the Bible actually went through. This is a situation where I feel like I got the answer correct, but I fucked up the method. It happens sometimes, and it's even happened plenty of times in the field of biblical studies. In this case, though, after properly researching the process that the NIV translation went through, I feel like my argument is even stronger than it was. So thank you so much to the host of this video that pointed all that out, because now my arguments are even stronger. So in my earlier responses to Dr. Kipp Davis, I pointed out the number of scholars that support my understanding of Galatians 1:19 as it refers to James, the brother of the Lord, being an apostle. I do want to emphasize that caveat, though, that this argument is only for distinguishing between James in chapter 1 and James in chapter 2 of Galatians. And this argument has very little bearing on whether or not James is an actual blood relative of Jesus. So I had only briefly researched the process through which the NIV translation was produced, and I hastily included this information in my video. In my previous responses to Dr. Kipp, I claimed that over 70 scholars agreed with me on the translation of Galatians 1:19, excluding James, the brother of the Lord, as being an apostle. I said that this was due to the need for 70% of the scholars that produced the NIV translation to agree to any changes that were made. I'm not sure where I got the 70% from. I actually can't find it in any of my research notes. It may have been something that my brain just misunderstood or something. I'm not sure, but that's also, more importantly, not where we should be focused. Instead of trying to figure out exactly the number of scholars that produced the NIV translation of Galatians 1:19 and how many of them agree with the translation that excludes James, the brother of the Lord, from being an apostle, I would much rather focus on the process that the NIV translation went through. While there were over 100 scholars that worked on the NIV translation, there was actually a very thorough and complex process that every single verse in the NIV translation had to go through. So while I may have been wrong about over 70 scholars agreeing with me as far as the NIV translation goes, but that doesn't mean that I can't use the NIV translation to support my argument about how well accepted this idea about James, the brother of the Lord, not being an apostle is in scholarship. Here is what the NIV website says about its translation process. A committee of 15 scholars was elected to oversee the process and the work of more than 100 translators, known as the Committee on Bible Translation. Its members were experts on the various languages, eras, and books of the Bible. They came from denominations across the spectrum of evangelicalism, from seminaries and universities across the country. While a distinct effort was made to create a diverse committee, every person on the committee was committed to the authority and truthfulness of Scripture, as was every translator who would work on the Bible. They were required to sign a statement of faith, affirming, quote, "The Bible alone and the Bible in its entirety is the Word of God written, and is therefore inerrant in the autographs," end quote. Or, a similar confession or creed. Following in the footsteps of Martin Luther's Bible and the King James Version, the work would be done in stages and reviewed by committees. 3 to 5 translators plus an English stylist were assigned to a portion of Scripture for the initial translation according to their areas of expertise. Manuscripts were then sent to the Intermediate Editorial Committee, the General Editorial Committee, and lastly, the CBT, which would approve every word in the final translation. Checks and rechecks, peer reviews, stylist reviews, additional checks, proofs, the process would be thorough. A variety of Greek texts would be consulted for the New Testament translation. Committees' reviews were brutal. Every word was scrutinized. So first off, the NIV translation is definitely a product of evangelical Christian scholars. Contrary to some people's opinion, this actually doesn't put me in a weird position. As I've stated many times before, I'm fine with even evangelical Christian scholars for some of the topics that are discussed. I'm especially fine with it when it comes to a translation of the Bible. For example, I've cited scholars like Robert Van Voorst, who is a Christian himself and who has had to sign similar statements of faith. And I use him for citations on like Tacitus and Suetonius and other extra biblical references to this supposed Jesus. So I don't really have an issue with the fact that some of these scholars are evangelical Christians. Don't get me wrong though, I do think that they have to be heavily scrutinized on certain topic areas, especially areas that include magical statements. It just means that you can't necessarily take them at their word when they come to some of their conclusions. And I would think that most historicists would agree with me on this as well. And I think the fact that the NIV was produced by hardcore evangelical Christians that were forced to sign statements of faith affirming that the Bible is the inerrant word of God only helps my conclusion, because even though they are dogmatically driven in this translation, they still render James, the brother of the Lord, as a distinctly different person than James the Pillar, who was an apostle. This concept in the NIV translation passed multiple different committee reviews and was heavily scrutinized. They knew what they were doing when they translated this. Second, you'll notice in these statements from the NIV's website that every single word that was translated was heavily scrutinized, debated, and finalized through a process that included at least 4 different committees, each committee with multiple scholars agreeing on the interpretations of this passage, at least enough scholars on each committee to pass a consensus. So just to reiterate here from what we learned from the NIV website, there is an initial committee of 3 to 5 translators with 1 English stylist. It was then forwarded to an intermediate committee that would again scrutinize, debate, and finalize the draft that went to the General Editorial Committee, where they again would scrutinize, thoroughly debate, and finalize the draft that would eventually get sent to the CBT. The CBT was made up of 15 scholars that would debate, scrutinize, and finalize the versions of the verses that would end up in the NIV. Just to remind you, this is the translation that renders James, the brother of the Lord, as not an apostle, and therefore distinctly different from the James that occurs in chapter 2. But wait! There's more! As I was researching the process the NIV went through, I did find other versions of the Bible that also rendered Galatians 19 in a similar fashion. The Berean Literal Bible also translates it in this way. But the Berean Literal Bible had a little bit less rigorous of a process that it went through in order to become published. It had smaller groups of scholars vetting the translations that were coming from subcommittees. So for the Berean Literal Bible, it starts off with public comments on the translations. And then from there, it would move on to this editorial and translating committee that would then finalize whatever was meant to be put into the Bible and sent to a main committee that would then scrutinize each translation and approve it to be published. Also worthy of note is that the Catholic New American Bible also renders Galatians 1:19 in this same fashion. And the current version of the NAB is unchanged since 1986. And in the revision in 1986, Galatians 1:19 maintained the translation that I am advocating for. So while I was wrong about a few things in my NIV argument from my previous videos, my conclusion is just that much stronger with the actual process that NIV went through. This particular translation has seen multiple different independent committees that have agreed that that translation is accurate and correct. Now, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely accurate and correct, but it definitely refutes this idea that there's no indication whatsoever in the Greek that James is not an apostle in chapter 1. Another minor mistake that I want to point out here before we jump into the actual video today is a mistake that I made in citing Hans-Dieter Betz in his commentary on Galatians. What I did was I hastily included all 3 authors in my count of how many scholars agree with me on the translation. One of the scholars cited was also used by L. Paul Trudinger, and then the other 2, I'm not exactly sure because I wasn't able to find those documents. So I don't know if one supported the Lightfoot citation or if they were both debating Lightfoot. But I feel like it would be better to focus on another statement that Hans-Dieter Betz makes in his commentary on Galatians 1:19. Betz does specifically say in that section, apparently, he was not regarded as an apostle, nor as one of the 12. Hans-Dieter Betz, Commentary on Galatians, page 78. And the citation given there, 207, just points to an early 20th century paper by Theodore Zahn that apparently establishes this particular statement. So, in effect, Betz would only really add one extra scholar to my previous count if we were even still focusing on that. But this is definitely a stronger argument to make on Betz's statements about Galatians 1:19. So, again, I have to say, I appreciate the host for pointing this out and allowing me to strengthen my argument and make it even better than it was before. All right, so now that we're done with my fuck-ups in the previous videos, let's get to Kipp Davis reacting to my Family of God video.
Is different from James the Pillar. We ended up discovering over 77 scholars that agree that the brother of the Lord and the pillar are 2 different individuals, which directly contradicts the statements that Dr. Kipp was making in his community post. This shows that Dr. Kipp is already working in the fringes of biblical scholarship, which...
Okay. Let's talk about this. 77 scholars, and you being on the fringes.
On the fringes.
Which is so rich coming from a mythicist. I'm sorry.
I know, right?
Like,
but it's not like it's necessary, right? Because they are on the fringes, so they have to kind of flatten that idea in order to make it respectable, right? Yeah. You're on the fringe. You're on a fringe. It doesn't matter,
right? But as with the caveat that I started off this particular video with, my conclusion that was rendered in the above section still stands, and it stands even stronger. Multiple independent, multi-stage, committee-driven biblical translations have rendered the James in Galatians 1:19 as not an apostle and distinctly different from the James in chapter 2. And just to reiterate here and emphasize, heavily emphasize, that is what this argument is about. It's not about whether or not James is a literal blood relative of Jesus. It's just about distinguishing the James in chapter 1 from the James in chapter 2. Now, both of these guys were laughing and cutting up because I stated that Kipp was working in the fringes of biblical scholarship, which that seemed to be the case at the time, and I still think that he is. However, I do want to point out that the host conveniently skips past the next part in my video.
This shows that Dr. Kipp is already working in the fringes of biblical scholarship, which I don't really have a problem with necessarily. But the arguments separating these 2 individuals as different people are far stronger than the arguments that are opposed to it.
Oh, I can see why they wouldn't want to put that on the stream. I mean, it really does take the wind out of their sails when they make fun of me about criticizing Kipp's fringe positions. Like I said in the video that they are reviewing, I don't have a problem with Kipp holding on to fringe positions. There are plenty of biblical scholars out there that hold on to fringe positions, that they are one of only a very few scholars that hold the position. I myself hold fringe positions. I've never shied away from that. My only issue is that from my perspective, it seems to me like whenever I go out there and I look for this debate, on whether or not James in chapter 1 is different from James in chapter 2, I find far more scholars supporting my position on it than the counter argument. My whole point in bringing up the fringe topic as far as Kipp's position goes is because regularly Dr. Kipp Davis and people of his ilk like to use this fringe nature as like a pejorative against mythicists. And it also means that statements that he made in his community posts were just flat out wrong. And I feel like that him holding on to a fringe position and chastising mythicists for having a fringe position, I feel like that makes him a hypocrite. And a little bit later in the stream, they actually had a special guest pop by, and they wanted to highlight what he had to say about me personally.
We may jump in mid-sentence, but right about here is where.
Can I just say one more? Like, yeah. I want to, if you could just pull up. Can I do it? I'm wrong computer. Captain Dadpool is right on the money here, right? The undeserved confidence is astounding. To call this a fringe idea is.
Oh, you mean this guy?
We started out this with you thinking that mythicists just sort of dismiss things, and I'm wondering if through our conversation, do you feel like I've just dismissed anything without reason?
I don't know if without reason is the best word. It's more like you have to cling to more fringe ideas in order to make them work, if that makes sense.
Like what fringe idea have I espoused?
Just
other than Jesus didn't exist.
No, just that Jesus was not actually born of a woman. He didn't actually, like, he was a fleshly being, but he was created in the firmament. Things like that almost no scholar is going to agree with.
Yeah, brilliant, right on the money.
No, this shows that there's a variety of opinions on this topic, and I happen to take one that is pretty common among scholars. It's certainly not something I've ever, this is not a fringe idea. There's a lot of scholars who are convinced that what G is getting at here is that the James that's mentioned in chapter 1 of Galatians is identified as the brother of the Lord. And then later in chapter 2, Paul talks about a meeting. In chapter 1, he's talking about this meeting he had with Peter and James. And then in chapter 2, he mentions, again, Peter, and he mentions James and John and identifies these guys as pillars of the church. And it's an open question, right? Is this James the same James as the James in chapter 1? But it's not a settled issue either. There are opinions on both sides of this. There are good arguments made by scholars that no, these are in fact two different people. But I don't happen to hold that view. I'm in line with a whole bunch of other scholars who say, yeah, James in chapter 1 is the same figure as James in chapter 2.
Weird. I do agree that this is a debated topic in the scholarship. I mean, obviously, I cited George Howard. I read through his arguments and why he thinks that Schrödinger is wrong. I just wasn't convinced by Howard's arguments. So I do agree that there is a debate in the scholarly community about this topic. So I guess my question is, what did Kipp originally argue? Luckily, it was on the internet, so, that shit stays on there forever. So let's just go back and refresh our memory about what Kipp exactly said about this topic. So no, there is nothing at all within the grammar in the Greek which indicates that James in 1:19 and James in 2:8 are different individuals. Rather to the contrary, the majority opinion among scholars is still that these are references to the same person. So let me get this straight real quick. Nothing at all turns into there are good arguments for, and the majority opinion among scholars has now softly turned into a whole bunch of other scholars. When called out on his misinformed understanding of the topic, Kipp would rather soften his statements and then pretend that that's what he said the entire time. As we saw, Kipp originally took a much harder position, saying that there is nothing at all to indicate that the James in 1 was different than James in 2. And now he's had to admit that there are scholars making that argument, at least to the point that there is a heated debate within the scholarly community, which means that his statement, there is nothing at all, was just factually wrong. Also, I really hate how instead of Kipp actually showing his work and showing the scholars that agree with him, the multiple scholars out there that agree with him, which I'm not doubting, by the way. Like, I'm fine if there are multiple scholars. I've even cited George Howard himself, even though I couldn't find other scholars. Even in my original video, I'm like, that doesn't mean that they're not out there, and I would really love for Kipp to produce these. But instead of actually producing them, he just vaguely references a whole bunch of other scholars. And I would love for him to produce a list. Just more than one scholar out there that is counter-arguing against Trudinger. I mean, that would be great for him to do. I'd love to read that particular scholar's position on it. It could change my mind. But as it stands, there's just a whole bunch of other scholars, which to me sounds like that claim in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, there's 500 people that saw Jesus resurrected. There's a whole bunch of people out there that agree with me. If you just compare what Kipp has done and just vaguely mentioning a whole bunch of other scholars without actually naming them, and then compare it to what I have done in my videos, and that's showing that at least 3 biblical translations that went through multiple levels of committees, scrutiny, debate, as well as all of the scholars that I directly mentioned by name in my videos, I feel like Kipp here is not exactly doing what a scholar should do. A scholar shouldn't just vaguely reference a whole bunch of other scholars. A scholar should be able to list the scholars if he's saying a whole bunch of other scholars. And I could provide a list with the scholars that worked on the biblical translations and then combine that with the scholars that I've already mentioned that definitely support my position. But again, I'd rather focus on the process that the biblical translations went through and also focus on the arguments that are advanced by people like Trudinger. I feel like it's much better to focus on the strength of the arguments from both sides rather than how many scholars out there agree with us. The only reason why I've emphasized how many scholars or the process that the versions of the Bible that I've mentioned in this video have gone through is because regularly Dr. Kipp and other historicists emphasize how many people agree with the position. So establishing that this is not actually a fringe position, that this is more of a mainstream position and a position that a lot of people take. The only reason why I make that is because Kipp is saying that not a lot of people accept it.
I need to say this as well. First of all, the arguments made for distinguishing these two figures as separate are, as I said, totally plausible. But these also have no bearing whatsoever on my opinion that James in chapter 1 is the brother of the dead human Jesus.
Oh, so he said before, maybe he just means in the stream, not like he's always held this position, but he said that both sides had plausible arguments. Let me see if I can find that in the community post. So no, there is nothing at all within the grammar in the Greek which indicates that James in 1:19 and James in 2:8 are different individuals. Rather, to the contrary, the majority opinion among scholars is still that these are references to the same person. The grammar is more difficult in the second passage, but there is nothing whatsoever to disqualify the widely accepted notion that this is the same James as mentioned in 1:19. Sensible readers will recognize that different terms are functioning in these passages with references to the same persons, and in fact, it makes the most logical sense to consider both James and Cephas together in both instances as members of the same groups. As I have already pointed out, there is not really any ambiguity here. James is explicitly included as a member of the apostles. He is not just some general Christian, and we know this because that is how the sentence is structured. This is not just a coherent argument, this is how to read the text. Richard Carrier has attempted to invoke an argument made by L. Paul Trudinger way back in 1975 ascribed to support James's exclusion from ton apostolon. But it simply does not work, which is why translators and commentators continue to treat the passage this way, as opposed to his preferred reading, other than the apostles, I saw only James. As pointed out by George Howard in response to Trittinger, if we are to accept Carrier's translation, the full clause must be awkwardly translated to reflect the same class of persons. But other than the apostles, I did not see anyone, except for the apostle, James, the brother of the Lord. No, he never said anything like, both of these arguments are plausible. He didn't even imply that sentiment anywhere. He's pretty clear that there's no plausible way to read that sentence differently. It seems like it's only now that the argument has been explained to him thoroughly that he has changed his position to say, well, both are plausible. And I guess he just thinks that his side is more plausible than the other. It's kind of weird how Kipp gets called out on his non-factual statements, and then he has to softly walk it back to something much softer that still maintains the position he was advocating for. The difference between Kipp and I is that I have shown in this video and in previous instances that if I get something wrong or I misstate something or I hastily research something, I'm more than willing to admit that I got something wrong. But it seems like, at least in this instance, Kipp is unwilling to do that. Instead, at least from my point of view, Kipp seems to prefer to spin a narrative to get his audience to believe what he wants them to. I feel like this means that Kipp's arguments will always be weak. Finally, I don't really have a problem at all with Kipp maintaining that this James in chapter 1 not being different or being different from the James in chapter 2 as not being essential to his argument. I'm perfectly fine with that position. This James in chapter 1 could not be an apostle, but also be the literal blood relative of Jesus. But here's Carrier's position that he states in OHJ. Certainly, in Galatians 1:19, Paul meant either James the Pillar or another James. And if he meant James the Pillar, then he did not mean he was literally the brother of Jesus, as that James appears to have been the brother of John, not Jesus. So to maintain that Paul means this James was the literal brother of Jesus, you have to conclude that Paul meant a different James in 1:19 than the one he mentions soon afterward in Galatians 2:9 and 2:12. But that means whichever James he is speaking of in 1:19 might not have been an apostle at all. And that means Paul may be using brother of the Lord yet again to distinguish apostles from other Christians, and not to identify the family of Jesus. Richard Carrier on the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, page 846. Carrier's statements here also work on Kipp's position. One of their arguments that we'll eventually get to in these responses is that Jesus is a more prominent figure with which to characterize James. If Paul is saying that this James in Galatians chapter 1 is directly related to Jesus, then we should also find Paul making the same kind of characterization of John and James in the next chapter. But we don't hear this at all. So while I think that Kipp's position is ultimately fine, I do feel like he's logically between a rock and a hard place. What Kipp seems to be doing here is mixing and matching information that he pulls from both Paul and the Gospels, as if the Gospels were any kind of historical account of Jesus. But ultimately, this argument about James in chapter 2 being different than James in chapter 1 is only a supporting argument for the much stronger argument in analyzing the Greek that definitely differentiates James in chapter 1 from the apostles. The fact that logically the James in Galatians 1 has to be a different James than the James that appears in Galatians 2 doesn't actually prove the conclusion that James isn't a blood relative to Jesus, but it definitely makes more sense on Carrier's argument.
It's, in my opinion, it's kind of a trivial point. And, you know, it's fine. It doesn't matter to me, really, if the pillar in chapter 2 is actually a different James than the James in chapter 1. But importantly, from a mythicist perspective, this is kind of a big deal. Yeah. It's pretty important for them to make this sharp distinction.
Oh, really? Well, let's just see what Carrier has to say about this. Many biblical scholars have concluded the same, that Paul meant this James was not an apostle. Whether or not he was the actual brother of Jesus. Richard Carrier on the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, page 848. So while this distinction does support the anti-apostle argument about James in Galatians 1, it's not essential for the mythicism argument. But let's just say that James, the brother of the Lord, being a literal relative of Jesus, is more likely on historicism than mythicism. How does this affect the mythicist conclusion? Well, let's see how Carrier factors this into his final a fortiori conclusion. However, I must argue a fortiori, and to that end, I shall say it's reasonably possible these probabilities go the other way around. In other words, that Paul would speak like this on those two occasions could be only 50% expected on mythicism, but exactly what we expect on historicity, or 50% expected on historicity, but only 25% expected on myth, etc. In other words, I think that this evidence is twice as likely on mythicism, but, though I doubt it, I'll allow that it might be twice as likely on historicity. I certainly cannot reasonably believe these passages, including their internal ambiguity and surrounding silence, are any more expected than that on H than on not H. Richard Carrier on the Historicity for Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, pages 850 to 851. So it kind of seems to me like Carrier has already included this argument into his a fortiori final conclusion as being evidence of Jesus existing. And that would be the 33% Jesus likely existed. The fact is that many mythological figures from the past, regardless of culture, have said to have had brothers, sisters, daughters, and whole lineages attributed to them. In Greek mythology, the gods are known to procreate with humans and have demigod children, thus having many brothers and sisters of each other and of the gods. In fact, there are whole families that proclaim divine lineage from the sun god Apollo. The imperial family in Japan had once claimed that they were directly descended from their sun goddess. And there are even some families in Britain who had at one time claimed to be direct descendants of King Arthur. A major concept from Christianity and Judaism is this idea that all of the current Jews, or at least all the ones that would be Jews in the New Testament, were all descended from Abraham. And Abraham himself is directly descended from Adam and Eve. You know, those first two people that God manufactured. None of those mythological people ever existed, and still they have people proclaiming to be directly related to them. So some guy proclaiming that he's Jesus's literal brother, or in fact other people proclaiming that some guy is Jesus's literal brother, is not strong evidence. And Paul never specifically mentions anybody directly knowing Jesus before he died and ascended into heaven. And all of the references that Paul makes to people are people that have experienced the risen Jesus. In Galatians 3:26 to 29, Paul proclaims this: So in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Galatians 3:26 to 29. This statement reinforces something that he said earlier in Romans. Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of flesh cannot please God. Romans 8:5-8. So the likelihood that Paul is more concerned with fleshly connections to Jesus rather than the spiritual connection is rather low. It seems to me, in all of Paul's statements, he is rejecting this fleshly association and embracing the spiritual connection that he has, as well as other Christians have, with Jesus. These spiritual connections are far more meaningful than any fleshly connection, at least. Galatians 1 even starts with Paul emphasizing that he did not get his information from anybody that exists on earth. He only received the information from the risen Jesus through revelation and through reading the scriptures. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Galatians 1:11-12. 12. It would be completely antithetical to Paul's entire theology if he were arguing for a fleshly connection to Jesus in Galatians 1:19. But regardless of all this, Carrier does count this statement in Galatians 1:19 and 1 Corinthians 9:5 as being literal blood relatives of Jesus, and therefore are twice as likely on historicity than mythicism. But this barely moves the needle because it's weak evidence. This evidence can't overcome all of the cultural context as well as the context surrounding Judaism, and especially Paul's theology. So, does the mythicist position hinge on this particular piece of evidence? Not at all. It does, however, really take the wind out of Kipp's sail when he describes mythicism as this fragile Jenga tower, where if you just remove one little argument, it all falls to pieces.
And this is like many of the mythicist arguments, one of these things where within mythicism, something that you see commonly is that as it's like we build our arguments like a tower. In you guys ever played Jenga?
Yeah.
With the blocks where you're building, you're pulling blocks out and stacking them on top of each other. For mythicism, quite often that Jenga tower is just one block stacked on top of another, so that if you remove a single point or position or argument, the whole thing is going to fall. And I mean that's a sure sign of an unlikely model, a poor model. If it's that flimsy that just one little change in it is going to basically cripple the entire thing, that's a problem. And I would say this is one of those problems.
Except, as we just saw, it's not. And that's something that a lot of historicists don't think to account for. On the Historicity of Jesus, Carrier does thoroughly investigate both the 1 Corinthians 9:5 as well as Galatians 1:19 and include both of them in his a fortiori conclusion. But for that conclusion, he counts them as evidence of historicity already. It's just not very strong evidence, and it barely moves the needle. So I feel like the real argument here is how strong this evidence is. And really, that's all that I've ever argued in my videos about this particular topic. I've laid out the argument that creates reasonable doubt for this as only being able to be read as a literal blood relative to Jesus. I provided that reasonable doubt to say that it's too ambiguous and we can't say whether or not James is a literal brother. And even if it is actual evidence of a blood relative, it's incredibly weak evidence. Kipp, on the other hand, thinks that this argument is so much stronger than all of the evidence that we have in the background knowledge that it overrides all of it. I think that that is far more unreasonable because that entails you disregarding all of our background knowledge that would factor into this passage. I would agree that there are way too many unresolved questions about this verse. And I feel like Kipp is still missing the mark on understanding the mythicist argument and really being able to factor in all of the background knowledge that we have to understand this verse. And before I head out, I just want to reinforce how happy I am to be corrected on a couple of my arguments, because that correction pointing out where I have misstepped has only made my argument stronger. So I really appreciate that. Well, that's it, heathens. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you thought about Kipp's position. Do you think that he softened it, or do you think that he stayed pretty consistent with everything that he said before? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like videos like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.